Tonight's story takes us deep into the cold hills of medieval England, where a forgotten abbey hums at dusk with voices that aren't quite human. The villagers say the monks have no tongues, only slivers of iron, and that their harmony keeps something ancient asleep beneath the chapel. This is the Iron Choir. If dark folklore, psychological horror, and slow-burning dread help you sleep, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and let the silence sing you to sleep every night. The wind rolled low over the heath, rattling the bare limbs of yew trees and pressing against the stone walls of Harlow's Edge Abbey, perched like a wart on the ridge above the moor. Smoke from the peat fires inside bent low with it, dragged eastward as if pulled by invisible hands. The sky had taken on the colour of old iron, thick, bruised grey with threads of rust red from the dying sun. There were no birds, not any more. A man trudged along the muddy path that led from the village of Barrowmarsh to the abbey, his cloak heavy with rain and travel. His name was Thomas of Ferndale, once a scholar at Wessex Court, now a penitent. His boots squelched through the wet ruts carved into the road by the carts of shepherds and brewers, but no such carts passed now. He had seen no other soul for hours. The moor had swallowed all sound save for the hum of the wind and the soft, rhythmic jangling of the iron rosary he kept tucked into his belt pouch. The abbey rose slowly from the earth as he neared, its silhouette like broken teeth against the dying light. A squat structure of soot-dark stone with narrow, eyeless windows and a crooked bell tower. No bell rang. A thick grove of yew trees grew unnaturally close to its walls, their twisted limbs bent as if eavesdropping. He paused 100 paces from the gate. The path ended in gravel and pale grass, all touched with frost, though it was only autumn. The iron gate was open, swinging gently on a hinge that moaned in protest. Beyond it, the abbey grounds lay still and empty, save for a lone monk in a black woolen habit, head bowed, standing motionless in the courtyard. Thomas stepped forward. The monk did not raise his head, nor did he speak. He merely turned, slow and deliberate, and gestured for Thomas to follow. The man's cowl was deep, casting his face in shadow. Thomas could see only a thin jawline and the glint of metal where a tongue should have been. They crossed the courtyard, past a weathered statue of St. Giles, with the face worn away by time or design. The abbey doors opened inward with a groan, revealing darkness and the cool stink of lichen and candle wax. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and carried a strange dry scent, like blood on old coins. The monk led him down a hall lined with alcoves and decaying tapestries that depicted saints Thomas did not know. Gaunt, hunched figures with mouths full of silver or fire. One bore no mouth at all, only a smooth expanse of skin where lips should have been, and 7 hands pressed to a book sewn shut with wire. They reached a small room where another monk waited, seated at a plain wooden desk. This one was older, his hood pushed back. The lines on his face were deep. His eyes milked with cataracts, and when he smiled, the glint of iron in his mouth caught the candlelight. Thomas bowed low. "I am Thomas of Ferndale. I was sent here by Prior Edmund." The old monk did not speak, nor did he nod. Instead, he lifted a slate from beneath the desk and scratched a few words with chalk. "You are expected. There are rules." He turned the slate and tapped it once with a pale finger. Thomas read it carefully, the weight of the moment settling over him. No speech after sundown. Do not enter the chapel until you are summoned. You must never, under any circumstance, interrupt the Iron Choir. Thomas hesitated, the words dulling the warmth of the room. He nodded once. The monk rose and motioned again, this time leading Thomas to a small stone cell on the 2nd floor. It contained a cot, a basin of water, and a crucifix so pitted and rusted it looked to have bled. The window overlooked the moor, where dusk was deepening. The air hung heavy. That night, as the sun finally slipped behind the moor's edge, Thomas sat upright on his cot, ears straining. At first there was nothing. Then came the sound. It began low, a murmur like wind caught between distant stones. It rose slowly, building into a hum, deep, smooth, and chillingly precise. It was not chanting. There were no words, only tone, harmony. 17 voices, he would later count. Not one off-key, not one louder than the others. They hummed as one body, one mind. The sound moved through the stone like water, seeping into the bones of the abbey. It vibrated faintly through the walls, resonating deep in Thomas's chest. He clutched the iron rosary tighter, his breath shallow. It was not beautiful, it was not divine, it was ancient, and it was not for the ears of men. He dared not leave his cell. Even had he wished, the stone door had somehow swollen in its frame, or the latch changed. It did not open. The humming continued for exactly 1 hour. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. In the days that followed, Thomas learned the rhythm of the abbey. The monks spoke not at all, even during daylight. They communicated in gestures and slate-scratched words. Each bore a scar beneath the chin, some clean, some ragged, and behind their teeth a sliver of iron glinted where tongues had once been. He asked no questions. He was there for penance. He scrubbed floors. He chopped wood for the ancient ovens. He helped the apothecary grind herbs into black powders and store them in unmarked clay jars. When he asked what the powders were for, the apothecary simply pointed to the chapel, then placed a finger to his lips. The chapel itself was a low, rounded structure of black stone that squatted beside the abbey like a sleeping animal. Its door bore a sigil that had been scraped away so many times only gouges remained. No windows, no cross. And always a monk standing watch beside it, not guarding the world from what was inside, guarding what was inside from the world. On the 6th day, Thomas saw something strange. One of the older monks, frail, his back bent like a question mark, collapsed in the courtyard. The others surrounded him in silence, gently lifting him. Thomas stepped forward instinctively to help, but was waved off. They carried the old monk not to the infirmary, but toward the chapel. He did not see the monk again. That night there were only 16 voices. Thomas awoke on the 9th night with a taste of rust in his mouth. His ears rang with a hum that had not yet begun. He sat upright and found his room darker than usual, the moonlight outside choked off by thick clouds. Then he heard footsteps, soft, bare. He rose and crept to the door, which was slightly ajar. Peeking out, he saw movement at the end of the hall, a shadow that glided, not walked. A monk, or something like one, robes soaked as though dredged from a lake. Its head turned slowly toward him. Where the face should have been, there was a mouth, only a mouth, stretching from temple to temple, filled with tiny iron bells where teeth should be. The mouth did not smile. It hung open, slack, humming a note that vibrated deep inside Thomas's skull. Then it vanished. The door slammed shut on its own. Thomas did not sleep. On the 10th day, he was summoned by the abbot, the old monk with cataract eyes. This time the abbot handed him a slate bearing a single line. "You have been chosen to join the choir." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I am not a monk," he said aloud before he could stop himself. The air changed at once. Cold. Heavy. The abbot's face did not move, but his hand wrote quickly. "You were sent here for penance. This is the price." Thomas stood. "No," he said, backing away. "No, I won't." The abbot tapped a brass bell once. A deep, reverberating tone filled the room, and from the shadows stepped 2 monks, each holding a thin rod of blackened iron, ends shaped like the tip of a blade. That night the humming began again. 17 voices. But one hummed slightly off pitch, just slightly, as if still learning. It would be days before it harmonized perfectly. The villagers of Barrowmarsh, far below on the moor, paused in their evening meals to listen. They sat in silence, heads bowed, as the sound passed over them like the shadow of something vast beneath the earth shifting in uneasy sleep, and deep beneath the chapel something stirred. Something old, something hungry, but still it slept, for now. The blood had dried in the corners of his mouth. He could not move his tongue, not because of pain, though the ache pulsed through the meat of his jaw like fire, but because it was no longer flesh. What rested now between his teeth was cold, metallic, and unnaturally smooth. Thomas lay in a cot not his own. The walls around him were made of a darker stone than his old cell. There were no windows. A single taper flickered in the corner, guttering against an unseen draught. Each breath he drew rasped against the taste of oil and metal and blood. He dared not swallow. The iron shard had been forced in while he was still conscious. He remembered the iron tongs, the pressure, and then the cold kiss of the sliver as it was pressed deep into the ruined stump of his tongue. It hadn't bled as much as it should have. Something had been rubbed into the wound before they began. Black, bitter paste from the apothecary's jars. It had tasted like smoke and old teeth. He had not screamed. There had been a pressure against his chest, a hand, firm and gloved, keeping him pinned. A monk he hadn't recognized, taller than the others, with skin pale as candle wax. His face had been heavily scarred, as though the iron hadn't taken the first time. The silence in the room had been absolute. When it was done, they left him alone. On the second night he tried to weep, but no tears came. His body refused it. His thoughts skittered through fragments of memory, his former life, the court at Wessex, the fire, the penance. He had begged for mercy. Not forgiveness, mercy. And what he had received was this. He reached into his robe pocket, his old robe neatly returned to him after the cutting, and drew out his iron rosary. It was no longer smooth. The beads had changed. Each one bore a tiny, hair-thin groove along its edge, almost like a mouth. He clutched it tight. Then, just before dusk, the door opened. A monk entered. Not the abbot, not one he knew. This one walked stiffly, as if each step were measured. He carried a thin branch of still wet with sap. Without a word, he motioned for Thomas to rise. Thomas stood, weak and slow, and followed. They walked through a passage he hadn't seen before. The walls narrowed. The stone grew rougher, older. Dust thickened the air. There were carvings here, barely visible, half-worn figures in the walls. Not saints, not angels. Creatures with faces hidden behind veils of iron. Some held mouths open in their hands. Others knelt before stone thrones that floated above pits. The air buzzed the closer they got. The corridor ended in a heavy wooden door, cracked but solid, rimmed with black bolts. The monk raised a hand and paused, waiting. Dusk. Somewhere above, a bell rang once, a hollow, flat tone. Then the monk opened the door. Thomas was led into the chapel for the first time. It was not what he expected. No pews, no altar, no stained glass. Only a wide, circular chamber, the stone walls sloping in toward a great black disc set into the centre of the floor. Around the disc stood the monks, 16 of them, forming a ring. Hooded, motionless, hands folded in front of them. The 17th space had been left for him. The humming began immediately. It did not rise slowly tonight. It came all at once, full, resonant, filling the chamber like a tide of perfect sound. Thomas stumbled. His ears throbbed, his eyes watered. But the monk behind him guided him forward, gentle yet insistent. He stepped into the ring. The moment his feet touched the inner circle, the iron in his mouth grew hot. He cried out, but no voice came. Only a vibrating tone matching the others. His body went still against his will. His chest expanded, his breath drawn by something deeper than instinct, and the iron hummed. He was part of it now. The song was not music. It was pressure, shaped and ordered. A resonance held in place by 17 threads of sound. It did not simply echo through the chapel, it moved through the floor. Downward. Beneath the disc in the centre, something responded. A low tremor stirred the stone. Dust fell from the cracks in the ceiling. The monks did not move. Their voices held. And in his mind, Thomas felt something vast turning toward him. It had no shape, no form, only gravity. Thought like suction. Attention like claws dragging across his thoughts. It did not speak, it remembered him, and he remembered something too. The scream, the first night long ago when the iron shard had been placed in a man's mouth. The memory was not his, but it ran through him now. A different body, a different century. The abbey had once been a Roman outpost. Then a Saxon shrine, then something else. Always the voices, always the ring of sound, always the watchers who gave up their tongues for the silence of the world. The thing below had many names, none human, none spoken. When the hum ceased, Thomas collapsed to his knees. The other monk stood firm. A voice, low and alien, coiled through his mind. You belong to me now. And then it was gone. The next day he did not eat. His hands trembled when he tried to hold a quill. He found himself humming at odd moments, his mouth moving without command. When he caught his reflection in a tarnished basin, he saw that the iron shard in his tongue had darkened, veins of rust branching across its surface like roots. His eyes, too, looked different, slightly sunken, slightly too still. He was changing, and others noticed. The apothecary passed him a vial with a simple chalk-marked T on the side. The liquid inside was dark, viscous. When Thomas frowned, the apothecary gestured to his throat and tapped the spot beneath the chin, then mimed the humming. Thomas drank it. It tasted of smoke and earth and something that wriggled. That night, when the humming began, Thomas joined it without resistance. He knew the pitch, knew the rhythm, knew that if one voice faltered, the thing beneath would wake. On the 12th night, a villager arrived at the gate, a boy no older than 16, pale, thin, shaking. He carried a bundle in his arms wrapped in linen, stained through with blood. His sister, he said, had wandered too close to the marsh and been bitten by something that no one had seen. Now she lay in bed, fevered, speaking in tongues. The boy begged for help. The abbot said nothing. He wrote a single word on the slate and showed it to the gathered monks. Tithe. Thomas watched as the monks surrounded the boy and gently took him by the arms. He did not struggle. He only asked, "Will it stop the voices?" And they nodded. That night there were 18. The song was fuller now, deeper, and something below moved again. Only this time it did not go back to sleep. A single crack formed in the black disc at the centre of the chapel, hairline, barely noticeable, but it pulsed, slowly, like breath. Thomas felt it through his feet, and in his bones something whispered, "The iron is not enough, not any more." The villagers of Barrowmarsh no longer looked up at dusk. Once, they had paused in reverence, mugs halfway to lips, children hushed, sheep stilled in pens, as the strange song from the abbey rolled down the moor like a mist of sound. It had been tradition, a holy mystery. Even those who doubted the church said it brought a certain stillness to the mind. Even those who feared it said it kept the nights quiet. But now it was different. The song had changed. There was more behind it than harmony, something sharper, something reaching. The first to speak of it was old Martha, the blind widow who lived beside the well. She claimed she saw shadows behind her eyes when the humming started, long, twisting things with no heads and too many mouths. Others dismissed her. Until her house was found empty the next morning, her crucifix bent backwards above her hearth. A week later, the village priest hanged himself from the rafters of the nave. On his chest had been carved a single word, deep and with trembling hands, silence. Within the abbey, Thomas no longer dreamed. Sleep came thin and grey. The hours passed with strange stillness. He would wake at odd angles, joints locked, mouth half open and humming softly even in slumber. The monks had stopped acknowledging him as an outsider. He had earned his place now. The scar beneath his chin had healed, puckered and dark, like something that had never been skinned to begin with. He could feel the iron in his tongue throbbing faintly throughout the day. It was no longer separate from him. It pulsed in rhythm with his heart. And still he feared the chapel. The black disc had widened. It was subtle, perhaps a trick of the light. But Thomas had taken to counting the stones around its edge. There were more visible now. The rim had shifted. The crack in the centre, too, had grown, thin as a hairline fracture, but longer. And when the song began, it pulsed, not from vibration, from something beneath it pushing. On the 15th night, one of the monks broke rhythm. It was only for a second, a sharpness in the harmony, a pitch that quivered. The others adjusted quickly, folding the sound back into unity. But Thomas had heard it, felt it, and he saw, too, the immediate reaction. The abbot stepped forward without ceremony. The faulty monk, young, red-haired, with fingers always twitching, did not resist. He stepped out of the circle and knelt at the edge of the black disc. He did not pray. The abbot removed a chain from beneath his robe. At its end, a shard of mirror, blackened and worn. He held it in front of the monk's face. The monk screamed without sound. The others did not react. The humming continued. 2 monks stepped forward and took the young man by his arms. They guided him, still humming, still weeping, through a low arch Thomas had never noticed before. It was set into the far wall of the chapel. Its lintel bore a single phrase carved in Latin. "He who fails, feeds." The door shut behind them. The faulty monk did not return. The next morning, Thomas was summoned to the library. It was not a place he had entered before. The door was small, plain, tucked behind a hanging drapery that bore no markings. Inside, the air was old and dry, stifling even. The shelves were crooked, bowed under the weight of scrolls and crumbling books. There was no order, only piles, stacks, bones of knowledge. The abbot was already seated at the centre of the room, a manuscript unfurled before him. His eyes were closed. His fingers traced the lines as if reading by touch alone. Thomas approached and waited. When the abbot opened his eyes, he gestured to the manuscript. On it were diagrams, circles within circles, mouths that spoke in loops. Symbols Thomas didn't recognise, etched in red. Some seemed to move when he looked too long. And in the centre of the page, a shape. It was not a creature, not exactly, but it implied life, movement, hunger, a mouth that was not a mouth, a cage, a womb. The abbot placed his hand over it and spoke for the first time in Thomas's presence, a whisper thin as dry leaves. "The choir is weakening." Thomas stared. "We hold the lock, but it rusts. The voice is dim. Each voice lost must be replaced." His mouth twitched at the edges, and even that may not be enough. Thomas found his own voice faltering. "What is it?" The abbot turned the manuscript and pointed to a symbol near the margin. An eye surrounded by spirals of thorns. The echo beneath, it was buried long before the abbey, long before speech. The first monks heard it in the stone. They sang not for beauty, but to smother. Not praise, but pressure. He leaned in closer. If the song stops, if the harmony breaks, it will rise. Thomas swallowed. And what does it want? The abbot looked past him. No one knows, but the ground remembers what it cost to bury it. That evening Thomas could not stop shaking. The iron in his mouth grew colder with each breath. He stood in the chapel once more, among the ring of monks, eyes drawn again and again to the black disc. It was no longer a disc, it was a door, and the crack in its centre had opened just enough to breathe. A single draught of warm air rose from the split, thick with the smell of rot and distant brine. It brushed against Thomas's robes and coiled around his legs like an unseen hand. When the song began, the air pushed back. He hummed, and the door held for now. 3 nights later, the bell in the village tower cracked in two. No storm, no strike, no wind. It simply split in the middle of the night, the sound echoing across the moor like a scream that would not die. The next morning, the moor water ran black. Sheep were born eyeless. Children cried out in their sleep, clutching their throats and speaking in unison. One voice is missing, one voice is missing, one voice is... And then they fell silent. Every child at once, as though something deep beneath the moor had exhaled and stolen their breath. When the village elder climbed to the abbey for answers, the gate was shut and locked from within. That night there were 19 in the choir. Thomas no longer knew where the new voices came from. He no longer asked, he simply hummed, and beneath the chapel something listened, and it was pleased. The chapel had grown warm, not with fire nor with bodies, but from beneath. The stone itself sweated. On the 24th night, Thomas reached down and pressed his palm flat against the black slab at the centre of the choir's circle. It thrummed beneath his skin like a distant heartbeat, slow, massive and patient. The monks stood in place, motionless as always, but a new tension pulled at their posture. Several swayed slightly, like trees in windless air. One had begun to twitch, barely just the pinky of his left hand, but enough to disrupt the illusion of eternal composure. And still the song went on. The harmony held, but only just. The villagers had stopped coming. They had always sent offerings, barrels of salted meat, bundles of herbs, candles by the dozen. Payment, they called it, or protection. But since the last child fell mute, the abbey's threshold had remained bare. Now, on the first day of the new moon, a single rider approached. He was dressed not in rags or linen, but in oiled leather and mail. His helm bore the insignia of Lord Werrick of Eastmere, and his steed was heavy with armour. He rode not up the trail, but straight across the moor, cutting a line through the dew-frozen heather. He bore no banner, only a message. Thomas watched from the high window of the bell tower. The others would not respond, he knew that, but something in him stirred, a flicker of who he had been before the iron, before the humming. A part of him remembered speaking, writing, arguing before the court, reading verses aloud by candlelight. He descended the stairs and opened the gate before he understood what he was doing. The rider paused. He had a blunt face, dark with stubble, and eyes like river stone. Without dismounting, he drew a letter from within his coat and held it out. Thomas took it in silence. The seal bore the insignia of the Eastmere Abbey Council. It had been broken already. He unrolled the parchment and read, "To the Brothers of Harlow's Edge Abbey. Your failure to respond to the inquiries of the ecclesiastic court regarding your rituals has been noted. No tithe has been paid, no sermons issued. The silence of your order is no longer tolerated. We have heard troubling reports, music at dusk, disappearances. dreams shared among the innocent. If no answer is received by the end of the month, a delegation will be sent to dismantle the chapel. By order of the Lord High Cantor, Thomas read it 3 times. Then he tore it into pieces and let the wind take them. The rider did not speak. He simply turned and rode back across the moor. That night the abbot wept. Thomas saw it with his own eyes. Alone in the library, hunched over a page from the old records. He sat shaking, face buried in his hands, tears darkening the parchment. No other monks approached him. They feared breaking the silence, even in grief. Thomas lingered at the edge of the room. Eventually the abbot wiped his eyes and reached for his slate. He scratched a single word onto its surface and held it up. Soon. The next day the doors to the chapel were sealed with chains. 4 monks worked the rusted locks, binding the ring around the great iron handles, while others stood in prayer at the threshold. There was no attempt to hide it. The abbey knew now it was not a matter of endurance, but containment. Something had changed. The crack in the floor had widened further. It now forked in 2 directions, like a root delving into unknown soil. At night, Thomas could feel the breath of the thing below, not only on his skin, but in his mind, sliding beneath his thoughts like a blade beneath cloth. He heard its words now, not spoken but implied. Thoughts pressed into the walls of his skull. You have hummed well, little mouth, but your notes grow thin, you break too easily. The iron in his tongue pulsed with heat. He tasted soot. On the 29th night, just before dusk, the abbey bells rang. Once, twice, a 3rd time. The monks froze in the halls. Bells never rang. There were no ropes, no pulleys. The mechanism had long since rusted shut. Thomas rushed to the tower, heart pounding, boots slamming the ancient stone steps 2 at a time. He pushed open the door and found no one. The bells swayed on their own, ropes snapping like old veins in the windless air. Then they stopped, and from far below, beneath the chapel, a new sound began. It was not the choir, it was not human, it was laughter, but not joy, not madness, something else. A sound that mocked the very act of sound itself, as if something ancient had finally remembered how to lie. The abbot gathered the monks in the dining hall. No one ate. The slate passed from hand to hand. We are undone. It hears the silence now. There must be more mouths. Thomas stood, shaking, and wrote a message of his own. We must warn the villagers. The abbot struck the slate from his hand. The villagers are the offering. Silence fell. Then, one by one, the monks nodded. And Thomas realized this had always been part of the pact. The villagers fed them, sheltered them, worshipped them, and when the iron grew weak, the choir sang louder. At midnight, the monks marched down into the crypt. Thomas followed, unwilling, feet dragging, breath ragged. Beneath the chapel, deeper than the choir's circle, deeper than the abbey foundations, was a stair carved into the earth. It spiraled like a conch shell, tight and slick with condensation. Each wall bore carvings, not Christian. Pictograms of ancient mouths opening in sequence, creatures giving birth to sound, eyes weeping music. And in the centre of the descent, a pit, a black hole in the earth, pulsing with breath. The abbot stood beside it and lifted the shard of mirror once more. He held it out toward Thomas. In it, Thomas saw his face, but his reflection was not humming. It was screaming. And then it opened its mouth wide, and Thomas saw inside. Not teeth, not tongue, just a tunnel, a perfect black ring of sound. They began to chant then, not with voice, but with their bodies, stomping, slamming their hands against the walls, shaking the air. The iron in their mouths took the sound and amplified it. The earth groaned. The pit breathed harder, and then from within a single hand rose. Not flesh, not bone, a hand of music, shaped from the pressure of every voice that had ever joined the choir, a construct of suffering and pitch. It reached for the air, and as it did, the humming above faltered. Something in the chapel cracked, stone, voice, or both. Thomas turned and ran. He did not remember climbing the stair. He only remembered the song breaking and the silence that followed. It was absolute. And then a whisper beneath the world. Your song has ended. Now listen to mine. The world did not end in fire or flood. It ended in resonance. Thomas woke to find the abbey silent. Not the holy silence of reverence or rule, but a dead silence, the kind that sucked the air from a room, that filled your lungs with pressure, that made your ears ring from the absence of sound. It was the silence of something waiting to speak. He rose slowly from his cot, head pounding. iron tongue throbbing. The others were gone. No footsteps in the hall, no flicker of candlelight, no soft brush of robes or scratch of slate. The stone walls themselves felt thinner. When he pressed his hand to them, he could feel a pulse behind the stone. Not a beat, a vibration, as though something on the other side were tuning. The chapel doors were wide open, chains rusted through, shattered like twigs. The circle of monks was no longer complete. Several lay sprawled across the floor, their faces twisted in contorted agony, mouths torn wide, iron shards melted to slag. The black disc in the centre, once sealed, once firm, was now a wound. Split fully open, a ragged circle leading down into darkness. And from that darkness came sound. It was not music. It was refusal given voice. Sound that hated other sound. Not chaos. A language with no words. It spoke in harmonic collapse. It bent every syllable of man-made song into rot. It infected the mind and made thought flinch. Thomas dropped to his knees, clutching his ears, sobbing without sound. And the thing beneath sang. Not to him. Through him. He felt his mouth widen. The iron in his tongue began to shiver, vibrating faster and faster until he could taste sparks. Blood welled up between his teeth. His jaw unhinged slightly, not by force but by design. His body had been remade slowly, subtly, to house this moment. He was no longer a monk. He was a mouth. Far below, the true choir emerged. Not men, not spirits. Shapes made of tone, of consonant pressure and vowel slick density. Humming constructs that folded reality inward with each note. Each was the echo of a person who had sung too well. Their faces were masks of stretched pitch, translucent skin buzzing with note threads like veins of silver lightning. They came through the crack, rising from the pit like fog made flesh, and they brought the voice. It was not a god. It was not a demon. It was the perfect listener. An entity ancient not because of time, but because it had waited longer than time to be heard. A prisoner of harmony, a warden of silence, buried beneath the world by the first scream of the first soul to feel shame. And now the harmony had fractured, and it was free. Thomas rose without wanting to. His feet moved to the centre of the chapel. The other survivors joined him, those few monks who still lived, mouths split, iron tongues singing without control. They stood in a circle around the crack, humming. But this was no longer the choir. This was invitation. The new sound spread through the moor like smoke. It did not roll across the ground. It infected it. Sheep convulsed. Birds fell from the sky. Rivers stilled, unsure whether to flow forward or back. In Barrowmarsh, the villagers stood frozen in place. Children opened their mouths and spoke with the same voice. The listener comes. Dogs howled, then fell silent. The wind ceased, and then for the first time in 1,000 years the voice spoke. It did not come from the pit. It came from within each of them. Not words, not names, just knowing. You silenced me, and so you sang. Now the song is over, and you are mine. Thomas wept, not because of fear, not because of pain, because the sound was beautiful, perfect in its horror, perfect in its wrongness. It called to something in him older than self, older than body, older than sin. It said, "Be my tongue," and he answered. His mouth opened fully, jaw unspooling, ribs cracking to make space. The iron within him liquefied, then reformed into a black key, ridged with notes no human voice could ever form. It slid down his throat and struck his spine like a tuning fork. The voice tuned him, and he began to speak back. Not alone. All of them. The monks, the villagers, the hills, the trees, the world. They answered. The abbey crumbled from the inside out, not in ruin, but in melody collapse. Stone vibrated into powder. The bell tower rang once more, a final peal distorted into a scream, and then folded in on itself with a quiet gasp. Yew trees bled from their trunks. The chapel floor fell away. What remained was a circle of mouths in a ruin of stone, and a voice rising like smoke over England. It would travel, through music, through prayer, through whispered dreams. And each voice that heard it would hum, and each hum would become part of the iron choir. And one day the voice would not rise again. It would simply be. The world as it always should have been, a single note, perfectly held forever. And so the song ends, but the voice remembers you. If you felt the cold breath of the abbey tonight, or heard something stirring beneath your floorboards, you're not alone. This is one of many sleep stories crafted for those who love their dreams dark and their nights darker. Subscribe now for more tales that whisper after midnight, and if you're brave enough, come back tomorrow. We'll be waiting.